Before gunpowder, the battlefield wasn't a clean clash of honor and steel. It was a brutal mess of mud, blood, and terror. No bullets, no distant shots. Just the thud of iron on bone, the scream of dying men, and the raw fear of looking your enemy in the eyes. Forget Hollywood. This is what real medieval combat looked like. Knights charging across open fields in polished armor. Enemies meeting sword to sword in noble duels. Death, yes, but always with dignity, purpose, and valor. That's the version passed down through tapestries, ballads, and epic poems. But it's not the truth. Most battles fought before the gunpowder age bore little resemblance to this idealized image. Warfare was rarely a stage for honor. It was a theater of panic, confusion, and survival. The myth of chivalry gained traction during the 12th and 13th centuries, particularly in Western Europe. Influential works like the Song of Roland or La Morte d'Arthur painted combat as a proving ground for noble virtue. Knights were imagined as paragons of courage and restraint, protecting the weak, respecting enemies, and fighting fair. But the reality was that these tales were written by court poets, not eyewitnesses. On actual battlefields, even knights often behaved more like opportunists than gentlemen. During the 100 Years' War, especially at Crécy in 1346 and Agincourt in 1415, English longbowmen decimated French cavalry before they ever got close enough to fight honorably. These knights, weighed down by armor and struggling in the mud, were slaughtered from a distance. There was no glory in its only blood and chaos. Chivalry didn't protect them. Arrows didn't care for lineage. Outside Europe, the concept of martial honor varied even more. In feudal Japan, Bushido is often misinterpreted as a code of constant, honor-bound combat. But historical samurai were often more bureaucrat than warrior. And when battles did happen, such as during the Genpei War 1180-1185 or the Sengoku period, they involved ambushes, sieges, deception, and brutality. Heads were collected as trophies. Prisoners were frequently executed. Mercy was not common. Practice, even in the Crusades, supposedly driven by holy purpose, brutality often overrode any sense of ethical combat. The sack of Jerusalem in 1099 saw Christian crusaders slaughter thousands of Muslim and Jewish civilians. There was no restraint, no measured swordplay, just indiscriminate killing in the name of God. That wasn't an exception, it was the rule. The distortion of battlefield reality was not accidental. It served political and psychological needs. Monarchs and military leaders needed soldiers to believe they were part of something noble. Chroniclers, often funded by those in power, crafted narratives that flattered their patrons and justified military campaigns. By the late Middle Ages, entire literary genres existed to paint knights as moral heroes. These stories helped conceal the butchery behind a curtain of symbolism and supposed honor. But real soldiers knew better. Men who fought in places like the Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302 or Bannockburn in 1314 didn't come home talking about chivalry. They spoke, if they survived, of comrades crushed under cavalry charges, of formations collapsing in mud, of screams and chaos. Most combatants weren't trained warriors, they were farmers, craftsmen, and conscripts, thrust into violence they barely understood. Honor was a story told afterward. In the moment, survival was the only rule. No matter the century or continent, the moments before battle were marked by tension, not triumph. Warriors didn't march into combat with confidence. They waited, often for hours, in silence or prayer. surrounded by the sounds of sharpening blades and quiet breathing. Whether standing behind a wooden shield wall in Saxon England or crouched beside a phalanx of pikes in Renaissance Italy, most soldiers felt the same thing: fear. Recruitment alone was a challenge. Armies in the pre-gunpowder world weren't made up of full-time professionals. They were cobbled together from feudal levies, mercenaries, conscripted peasants, and in some cases, volunteers seeking spoils. In the 13th century Mongol invasions, Genghis Khan's armies moved with staggering organization, but his success relied as much on loyalty and discipline as it did on fear, both from his enemies and his own troops. In contrast, European feudal lords called up vassals bound by duty, not always by skill or readiness. Logistics were a nightmare. Feeding an army required immense planning. At the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, the Polish-Lithuanian alliance fielded over 30,000 troops. Keeping them supplied meant coordinating oxen carts, foraging teams, and long columns of camp followers, blacksmiths, cooks, and even prostitutes. Food shortages could break morale before a single sword was drawn. Disease moved quickly in crowded, unsanitary camps. Dysentery and infected wounds killed far more men than enemy weapons. Camps were temporary cities, filled with tensions. Rivalries between units, especially those from different regions or cultures, often led to internal skirmishes. Mercenary companies, like those in the Italian wars of the 15th century, might change sides if payment faltered. Trust was fragile. Orders could be lost in translation. Leaders like Saladin and Edward I had to manage not only the battlefield, but the volatile mix of personalities within their own ranks. Pre-battle rituals varied across cultures, but shared one purpose: survival of the mind. Roman legions offered sacrifices to Mars before marching. Medieval Christian knights heard Mass and took confession, believing death on the field could cleanse their sins. In Japan, samurai composed death poems before combat. These weren't mere customs, they were ways of confronting death in advance, of reducing fear to something ritualized and manageable. But psychological preparation meant little without strategic clarity. Without firearms, battles hinged on close-quarters formations and terrain. At the Battle of Hastings in 1066, William of Normandy broke the English shield wall not by force, but by deception. Feigned retreats lured Harold's forces out of position. In 1314, at Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce used narrow terrain to neutralize English cavalry. In both cases, terrain and discipline mattered more than numbers. Commanders studied the land more than the sky. Hills offered vision, rivers formed barriers, forests hid ambushes. The right ground could win the day before a single charge. But even with perfect planning, the hours before a clash were filled with uncertainty. The outcome depended not just on strategy, but on whether men could hold their nerve, whether they'd break and run, or stand and fight. Before the first sword is drawn, the battlefield is already alive with noise. Orders shouted down the line in multiple dialects, drums pounding to set formations, shields clattering as men brace for impact, horses snorting and stamping in tight clusters. The sound of war wasn't just loud, it was disorienting, constant and inescapable. In ancient Greece, phalanxes advanced to the beat of flutes, not for elegance, but for coordination. The Spartans, known for discipline, used rhythm to maintain tight ranks, but once formations collided, the precision gave way to chaos. Spears splintered against bronze. Men screamed, some in rage, others in pain. Helmets rang as swords glanced off them. Armor groaned under pressure. The din was so intense that soldiers often couldn't hear their commanders or even their own breath. The Roman legions added another layer of mechanical violence. Their short swords, or gladi, were meant for stabbing in tight formation. Metal. Stabbing into flesh produces a sharp, wet sound quick, but repeated. In battles like Cannae in 216 BCE, where Hannibal's forces encircled and crushed over 50,000 Roman troops, the soundscape would have been unbearable. Shouts turned into cries. Trampling feet turned into crunching bones as the dead and wounded were stepped on, deliberately or not. In medieval Europe, mounted knights added new elements. Horses, armored and trained for war, were themselves weapons. The thunder of hooves over open fields, combined with the clatter of chainmail and lances striking shields, created a wall of noise. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 offers a stark example. As French cavalry charged the English lines, they sank into thick mud. The horses screamed, riders cursed, arrows whistled overhead. When the cavalry finally made contact, the result wasn't clean. Impact hit was a mess of snarling animals, collapsing armor, and human panic. Siege battles brought their own acoustic terror. At the Siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, Roman siege engines hammered the city walls with massive stones. Defenders heard them coming seconds before impact. The walls didn't just crumble, they cracked and echoed, sending splinters and shockwaves. Inside, civilians wailed, priests chanted, and fires roared through the lower quarters. In close quarters, men often didn't see who killed them. The noise made it impossible to locate threats. Behind every clang of steel was the risk of a blade from the side or back. In the heat of battle, many couldn't tell if they were bleeding until they collapsed. The noise drowned out even their own injuries. Battle was confusion, not choreography, and its sound brutal, erratic, and deafening was often the last thing anyone ever heard. Hand-to-hand combat in the pre-gunpowder world wasn't about precision or technique under pressure. It was about instinct, endurance, and staying alive long enough to swing again. It meant fighting in tight spaces, often shoulder to shoulder, where a mistake didn't mean a bruise, it meant death. Swords were not elegant instruments in these settings. The arming sword, common across medieval Europe, was often used to bash, bludgeon, and thrust in short bursts of violence. Edges dulled quickly against mail and bone. The tip, when driven into weak points, armpits, necks, gaps in armor, was more effective than any dramatic overhead swing. A knight in full plate would often use a misericord, a long dagger designed to pierce through the eye socket or under the ribs to finish off a downed opponent. These weren't cinematic duels. They were dirty, panicked stabs in the middle of screaming crowds. Axes, like the Viking bearded axe or the Francisca used by the Franks, were brutal but practical. They could hook shields, crush helmets, and sever limbs, but they required space and strength. In close combat, one clean swing was rare. Instead, it was common for fighters to crash into each other, wrestling in armor, trying to create just enough distance for a finishing blow. Spears were more common than many realize, especially in large formations. Roman legionaries carried the pilema, heavy throwing spear meant to disable shields. Later, pikes and halberds defined Swiss and Flemish infantry tactics, allowing formations to push, stab, and break through enemy lines. But when those lines broke, when formations collapsed, the long spears were dropped or discarded, and men grabbed anything they could to stay alive. Fatigue set in fast. In 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, soldiers fought for hours. Contemporary sources describe men collapsing in place, too weak to raise a shield. Mail armor was heavy. Helmets restricted vision and breath. Blood, sweat, and mud made weapons slippery. A disarmed man rarely had time to recover. He was trampled, stabbed, or left to choke in the dirt. And there were no clean deaths. Blades got stuck in bone. Arrows didn't always kill instantly. Wounded men screamed for water, for help, for mercy that rarely came. The psychological weight of killing up close was heavy. In the Norse sagas, warriors often went into battle in a trance-like state known as berserkergang, possibly to suppress fear and guilt. In Japan, samurai training emphasized detachment and ritual. In medieval Christendom, confession before battle helped ease the conscience, but the trauma lingered. Chroniclers in the Crusades wrote of men unable to sleep for days after combat, not from pain but from the memories. There was also no guarantee of survival even after victory. A glancing blow to the leg could mean infection. A dented helmet might hide a fractured skull. Medical treatment was primitive. Wounds festered. Amputations were common. Death, for many, came slowly after the battle ended. This was the core truth of pre-gunpowder warfare. There was no distance, no abstraction. You saw the eyes of the man trying to kill you. You smelled his sweat. And if you won, you carried the memory of how it felt to take his life not in glory, but in exhaustion. A medieval battlefield didn't resemble a chessboard or a noble painting. It was a pit of human ruin or symmetry, no honor, no clear boundaries between life and death. The aftermath of combat left behind more than silence. It left broken bodies, mutilated faces, and a stench that lingered for days. At the Battle of Visby in 1361, when Danish forces clashed with Gotland's peasant militia, the results were recorded not just in chronicles, but in the ground itself. Hundreds of skeletons were later excavated, still clad in chainmail, their bones marked with deep blade wounds, skulls split clean through, arms severed, jaws crushed inward by blunt weapons. One boy, no older than 15, had his shin bone shattered by a sword-cutter wound that would have left him immobile before he was killed outright. There was no elegance in how these men died, only force and proximity. The terrain amplified. The suffering rain turned soil into sludge. Bodies fell and vanished beneath the mud, only to be trampled by cavalry or pushed aside by fleeing infantry. In low-lying areas like Agincourt in 1415, heavy armor pulled soldiers under. Some drowned in shallow pools, unable to stand in the thick clay. Horses slipped, landed on their riders, and broke bones before the enemy even arrived. The weight of armor that once protected became a liability in the blood-soaked earth. The wounded who managed to crawl away faced no relief. Infection followed quickly. With no understanding of germs, battlefield medics, if any were present, used unwashed tools to cut away dead flesh. At the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, arrows that penetrated deep into muscle were often left in the body. Extracting them would only cause more damage. Limbs with shattered bones were amputated using saws, leather straps for restraint, and often no anesthetic. Some soldiers survived. Most didn't. Carrion birds arrived before the battle ended. Crows and vultures circled, waiting for the final screams to fade. Stray dogs picked through the wreckage by nightfall. The smell of blood mixed with sweat, manure, and excrement. Many soldiers lost control of their bowels in their final moments. The scent of rot settled quickly. Those tasked with burying the dead, when anyone did often, did so shallowly, especially in mass graves. At Towton in 1461, one of England's bloodiest battles, over 20,000 men died. Many were dumped together, limbs interlocked, some with dagger wounds to the back of the skull, evidence of executions during retreat. Weapons didn't just kill, they disfigured. Warhammers crushed ribs and caved in helmets. Maces turned spines to pulp. Flails shattered faces. Archers, like the English longbowmen, fired volleys into packed enemy lines. Arrows rarely killed cleanly. They pierced thighs, abdomens, and eyes. A man hit in the gut might live for hours, moaning, vomiting blood, begging for water until silence came. War stripped men of identity. Once the fighting ended, scavengers combed the battlefield. Dead nobles were stripped of their armor. Commoners were looted of boots and tunics. Coins were taken from corpses, rings pried from fingers, teeth sometimes removed, anything of value gone. This was the true shape of the battlefield. No glory, just blood, bone, and mud stacked in layers, soaked into the ground, and forgotten by all but the survivors. Formations were the backbone of pre-gunpowder warfare. The shield wall of the Anglo-Saxons, the Macedonian phalanx, the Roman testudo wall, were designed to control chaos, to turn individual fear into collective strength, but none of them were invincible. When formations broke, they didn't unravel slowly. They collapsed violently, dragging entire units into confusion, slaughter, and retreat. At the Battle of Hastings in 1066, the English shield wall, initially held against Norman cavalry, formed tightly with overlapping shields and spears braced for impact. It was nearly impenetrable. But William of Normandy's forces used repeated, feigned retreats, tactical withdrawals that lured English troops out of position. The moment gaps appeared, the wall lost its strength. Knights surged through the breaches, and cohesion gave way to panic. Once that unity cracked, the outcome was decided. The phalanx used to deadly effect by Alexander the Great depended entirely on discipline and terrain. Hoplites or pikemen stood in tight ranks, spears projecting outward in layers. But if terrain was uneven, the line could stagger. A single stumble in the front rank could ripple backwards, disrupting timing and spacing. At the Battle of Cynocephalae in 197 BCE, Roman legions exploited this vulnerability. The phalanx, rigid and slow to adapt, was drawn into rough hills. Its right wing collapsed when it met the flexible Roman manipular system. Formations shattered not by force, but by maneuver. The Roman legions, while more adaptable than earlier phalanxes, were not immune to collapse. At the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 09 CE, 3 Roman legions under Publius Quinctilius Verus were ambushed in dense woodland by Germanic tribes led by Arminius. The tight formations Rome relied on were useless in the trees. Roads turned to mud, lines were stretched and fragmented. Rain, betrayal, and terrain stripped away their advantages. By the end, nearly 20,000 Roman soldiers were dead, cut down in disorganized pockets. Their famous formations, irrelevant. Even psychological pressure could shatter formation. At the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, English cavalry charged Scottish. Chiltern's tight circles of infantry armed with long pikes. Initially, the cavalry struggled, but when English foot soldiers failed to support them, confusion spread. A sudden appearance of Scottish reinforcements from the woods, combined with poor visibility and low morale, triggered a retreat. The English line, once dense and dangerous, dissolved into a rout. Fatigue also played a role in extended engagements, like the Battle of Totan in 1461 fought. During a snowstorm for over 10 hours, exhaustion chipped away at cohesion. Arm muscles cramped, feet lost grip, shields slipped. Veterans might hold their position, but levies and conscripts began drifting, breaking rank, or fleeing. One weak flank was all it took for a collapse to spiral across an entire army. Formations promised order, but they demanded focus, trust, and unity. The instant one element faltered terrain, discipline, morale, structure buckled. And once that structure gave way, the battlefield returned to its most basic form. Every man for himself. The battlefield wasn't dominated by knights in shining armor or disciplined warrior elites. The reality was far more ordinary and far more desperate. Most pre-gunpowder armies were built from the ground up, filled not with seasoned professionals, but with farmers, fishermen, blacksmiths, and day laborers who had never seen real combat before, being handed a weapon and marched into war in medieval Europe. The concept of the feudal levy meant that landowners were required to send men to fight on behalf of their lord. This obligation often fell to peasants who were neither trained nor equipped for war. At the Battle of Courtrai in 1302, also known as the Battle of the Golden Spurs, thousands of Flemish urban militia, many of them weavers and tradesmen, defeated heavily armored French knights. They fought not out of military tradition, but out of necessity, anger, and local solidarity. Their weapons were rudimentary: pikes, maces, flails, and repurposed farming tools. Yet their discipline and use of terrain won the day. The myth of noble exclusivity also collapses when looking at armies like those of the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan's forces in the early 13th century were composed of highly mobile horse archers, but many support units and conscripts came from subjugated tribes and newly conquered territories. Some were forcibly recruited, others joined too. Avoid execution. Ethnic diversity and mixed allegiances were common, and so were differences in training. A Mongol vanguard might include a hardened cavalry corps, followed by foot soldiers who had been drafted just weeks earlier. In Japan's Sengoku period, from the late 15th to early 17th century, samurai received most of the attention in chronicles, and later romantic retellings. But by the time of battles, like Nagashino in 1575, the majority of troops were Ashigaru foot soldiers recruited from the lower classes. Their primary role was to fill the ranks, carry supplies, and absorb losses. Samurai provided leadership and elite shock power, but the Ashigaru fought and died in much larger numbers. Mercenaries added another layer to the battlefield composition. In Renaissance Italy, condottieri professional military contractors, their services to the highest bidder. These weren't local conscripts. They were men who fought for pay, not principle. Some, like John Hawkwood's White Company in the 14th century, gained reputations for effectiveness and brutality. Mercenaries could tip the balance of power in a conflict, but they were also unpredictable. If funds dried up, they might switch sides or sack the very towns they were hired to defend. Age and physical condition varied wildly. Teenage boys stood next to gray-bearded veterans. In many medieval battles, entire villages marched together. Family members often died side by side. There was no formal boot camp, no structured training for most recruits. Survival depended on instinct, luck, and the ability to follow orders under pressure. The front lines were shaped not by heroic legends, but by those who had little choice. Their presence filled the gaps left by noble rhetoric. The fate of kingdoms often rested in the hands of men who had never left their village until war came knocking. Victory in pre-gunpowder warfare rarely meant order. It meant permission. Once the enemy line broke, the rules, if there had been any disaster, battlefield shifted from combat to exploitation. Corpses were stripped of valuables. Wounded enemies were finished off, not spared. And surrounding towns and villages, already trembling at the sound of war, became the next targets. At the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, English forces under Edward the Black Prince defeated the French and captured King John II. But for the lower rank survivors, the real prize lay elsewhere. The battlefield was littered with the dead and dying, many of them nobles in expensive armor. Stripping corpses was efficient. Armor was worth more than a common soldier's lifetime of wages. Purses were cut from belts, rings pried from fingers. Even teeth were sometimes pulled for their gold. And if a wounded knight resisted, a dagger to the throat ended the matter quickly. Looting was not only tolerated, it was expected. It acted as a bonus for soldiers, especially those who hadn't been paid in months. After the Battle of Visby in 1361, the dead were buried still wearing fragments of armor, suggesting looting was interrupted or incomplete. But where time allowed, the defeated were left with nothing. For many survivors, scavenging was the only reward for their trauma. Mercy depended entirely on status and circumstance. Nobles captured alive could be ransomed. At Agincourt in 1415, Henry V ordered the execution of hundreds of French prisoners, despite their potential ransom value. His army feared a renewed attack and couldn't risk being outnumbered by captives if the tide turned. There was outrage from the French aristocracy, but on other occasions they had done the same. Commoners received no such consideration. If they surrendered, they were often cut down immediately. A sword through the spine was quicker than dragging prisoners back to camp. Entire communities paid the price for proximity to battle. During the Hussite Wars in the early 15th century, victorious armies frequently razed enemy-aligned villages. Fields were burned, wells poisoned, churches looted. Women and children were not spared. In 1099, during the First Crusade, the Christian capture of Jerusalem ended with mass slaughter. Jewish and Muslim inhabitants were butchered in the streets. Some accounts describe blood reaching the ankles in certain parts of the city. While exaggeration is possible, the violence itself is undisputed, even when armies claimed moral or religious purpose. Behavior after victory often revealed different motives. Pillage wasn't always about greed. Sometimes it was about vengeance. At the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, Ottoman forces under Bayezid I executed thousands of captured Europeans. Crusaders, most of them French and Hungarian. Many had mocked their Turkish opponents before the battle. Few survived to regret it. Victory didn't bring peace. It extended the violence in new forms, slower, crueler, and far less organized. For those who had survived the chaos of combat, the aftermath was a different kind of horror, a scramble for spoils, a collapse of restraint, and a final, brutal reminder that even in so-called honorable wars, humanity was often the first casualty, long before psychologists defined post-traumatic stress disorder. The damage done by war was visible but rarely understood. Soldiers returned from battle changed. Some were silent, others violent. Many turned to drink, isolation, or the church. Pre-modern societies didn't recognize trauma in clinical terms. but they saw its effects on the body, on behavior, and on belief. In medieval Europe, the Church interpreted battlefield trauma through a spiritual lens. A knight who broke down after combat might be viewed as cursed or afflicted by divine punishment. Confession and penance were offered as treatments. The idea was not to heal the mind, but to cleanse the soul. War was considered both a duty and a test. If a man struggled afterward, it meant he had failed that test or carried hidden sin. Yet chroniclers recorded strange behaviors that align closely with modern trauma symptoms. After the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, some English veterans were noted to have difficulty sleeping, became volatile, or refused to return to service. During the 100 Years' War, French sources mention soldiers haunted by the sounds of the field long after the fighting ended. These accounts, though brief and scattered, hint at a common thread: psychological damage, masked by silence or ritual in the East. Samurai culture recognized the burden of war, though not in psychological terms. Failure or dishonor in combat could result in seppuku ritual suicide, not only to restore honor, but perhaps also to end suffering that had no other explanation. Warriors who survived defeat often faced shame worse than death. The internal collapse after battle was seen not as trauma, but as spiritual imbalance or moral failure. For common soldiers, the burden was no lighter. Peasants conscripted into war returned to villages with injuries, nightmares, and deep emotional scars. But without rank or status, few could afford to process what they had endured. Many turned to alcohol. Some became vagabonds. Others were absorbed into bands of mercenaries, unable or unwilling to return to civilian life. In the Roman world, military physicians like Galen recorded melancholia in wounded veterans. While not linked directly to battlefield experience, it described symptoms resembling depression. Centuries later, in the Crusades, monks described soul sickness among returning warriors: restlessness, rage, apathy. Again, it was treated with prayer, not understanding. The trauma of war was persistent, but invisible to the societies that created it. Without language to describe psychological wounds, ancient and medieval fighters were left to endure them alone. The consequences rippled outward into families, communities, and generations long before anyone knew what to call the damage. Gunpowder didn't arrive all at once, but once it did, it rewrote the rules of war. By the early 14th century, crude hand cannons had already made their way into European arsenals. By the 15th, gunpowder was no longer an experiment. It was a force that ended centuries of warfare built around armor, formations, and hand-to-hand killing. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 marked a turning point. English longbowmen famously devastated French cavalry, but tucked among their ranks were primitive cannon reboldequin firing iron pellets and stone balls. Their tactical value was limited, but the psychological effect was enormous. Thunderous explosions, clouds of smoke, and the sheer noise shocked troops used to swords and arrows. The weapon's future was now a matter of refinement, not theory. By the time of the Ottoman siege of Constantinople in 1453, gunpowder had matured. Sultan Mehmed II brought with him a Hungarian-made bombard named Basilica, capable of hurling 600-pound stone balls over a mile. The walls of Constantinople, which had withstood centuries of invasion, crumbled in weeks. No formation, no shield, wall, no gate could stop this kind of power. Fortifications that had defined medieval defense were now obsolete. Armor, too, began to disappear. Full plate had reached its peak in the late 15th century, beautiful, functional, nearly impervious to blades, but it was useless against early firearms. A single lead ball from a harquebus could penetrate breastplates, sometimes even at long range. Soldiers didn't abandon armor overnight, but piece by piece, the burden of steel was traded for mobility. An muskets. Close combat didn't vanish, but it changed shape. Pike and shot formations, like those used by the Spanish tercios, combined musket volleys with long pikes to fend off cavalry. These units were complex, slower to maneuver, and required professional training. The age of peasant levies and feudal militias was closing. War was becoming industrial, standardized, impersonal. Gunpowder ended the age of ritualized violence. There was no code of chivalry when a man was felled by a musket ball from 30 yards away. No time for duels. No chance to surrender before the cannon fired. Killers no longer needed to see the eyes of the dying. Death came faster, and from farther away. By the 17th century, war had become something else entirely. Nations, not lords, waged it. Standing armies replaced seasonal levies, and the battlefield once defined by blood, mud, and blades was now shaped by fire, smoke, and iron. The world had crossed a line, and it wasn't going back.